well, thank you very much to begin to Vincent and Reggio for the invitation and for the organization, and also to Marie, who just came in for the organization of the logistics and those important things also. Thank you, Didier and Adrien, for reading the paper that I prepared, which is effectively a little bit of a part of a future manuscript that I'm going to hopefully write this summer, which will be turning my PhD into a book. So hopefully we'll have the occasion in the near future to discuss the actual book itself. But for now, these are ideas that are going around in my mind based on my PhD studies. And I should also mention that Mr. Peclar was also part of the jury in my PhD, which I finished in December 2020. And so he's probably read a little bit of these ideas, but I've tried to mix them in with some other theories, and so I think that will be hopefully interesting for him too. So for the discussion today, I titled it "The Illiberal State Building in Angola's Peripheries." It's going to have a specific approach through political economy, specifically rural political economy, because we're talking about the peripheries, which is going to be the aspect which is a little bit different and hopefully novateur, if I can say that, for the subject of this illiberal state building in Angola, because we do have some researchers who have already taken on this subject in different ways. Didier has also talked about this, specifically Ricardo Suarez de Oliveira has also taken on this topic in different ways. But the rural political economy aspect of the illiberal state building in Angola's peripheries hasn't really been taken on fully. And so that's what I tried to do in this paper, and that's what I'll try to do in the next 20 minutes. So what we're discussing, or what I'm trying to discuss here, is one of the fundamental questions in political science and in African studies, which is the role and the nature of the state in Africa. What does it do? What should it do? And specifically here, we're talking about the peripheries. So we're not talking about urban areas. We're talking about the countryside, where the government is going to be less present. And so here specifically, one of the interesting things about this approach of illiberal state building, which I'm going to get into in the first section when I talk about the theory and the history, it is this idea of political imagination of the elites as they try to rebuild and renew themselves, which is going to add a secondary aspect to state building or governance in Africa, which I'll get to in the first part, which is going to be based on the theory and the history. I'd also like to mention that this research is integrated into the different axes of LAM's research agenda, particularly Axe 1, which is État, régulation et contestation dans les Afriques. So we're directly taking on the question of the state and its relations with its population, specifically rural populations. And also it enters into Axe 4, which is Marché entrepreneuriat en Afrique, specifically from the rural political economy perspective, which we're going to be discussing throughout. So the overall objective is to open a space of dialogue and contribute to the theoretical debate of how authoritarian African regimes project their power and authority into peripheral frontier spaces where they are the least present. By frontier, we're referring to the process of spatial control by the state in areas considered undeveloped or underdeveloped, according to a modernist Rostauian development thought, where the planification of the commodification of resources creates a zone of destruction and creation of property systems, whether they're from communal to public or private, political and social structures from traditional to modern, and also life worlds and cosmologies to make way for new projects and new political aspirations. And so this in-depth study of Angola can serve as a model for ongoing and future research projects, I hope, of similar dynamics, which we discussed today with Adrien, who also is working on rural Tanzania, and he has seen some similarities and differences, which is one of the roles of this discussion today, which is to try to bring out a bigger conversation about rural Africa and how it's governed. So one of the ideas that I'm going to try to build upon here is kind of a provocative question, which is, for example, can state-owned companies help build states? What about cooperatives? Can a cooperative assist in building a state? These are open questions that are not typically asked, but I'm going to try to make the case that yes, in authoritarian Angola, we can argue that it's more of a projection of state building rather than state building in its more concrete sense, the pun intended. But perhaps in the sense of state building here, rather focusing on the processes of bureaucracy and administration, which is a central part of Dominique D'Urbon's l'état projeté, which I'm going to be discussing. But instead of looking at the administrative processes themselves, maybe we can focus more on the forms and the processes and the different actors involved in governance itself. Francis Fukuyama laid out a book connecting these two ideas, state building and governance in the 21st century in 2004. And maybe it's no accident that this book was written at the same moment that the Angolan government embarked upon its national reconstruction campaign, based heavily on a strategy of governance via local and state actors rather than a larger government building of its own administrative state. So in order to discuss these questions, we're going to first, in the first part, talk about the theory and the history. So talking about Dominique D'Urbon's état projeté, or projected state, and how I'm going to look at it from a different perspective than what his article lays out in the administrative question of Africa. And also play upon this idea of illiberal state building, which is part of a Oxford working group that is headed in part by Ricardo Soares de Oliveira, who, as I mentioned earlier, has already worked on this question of Africa's illiberal state builders. So after the first part, which is the theory and history, I'm going to go over a very quick sort of case study to try to create a concrete link between the placement of history of Angola's emergence after the Civil War and its setup of creating this illiberal state building in the peripheries, notably through the 2001 program that was created by the African Union called NEPAD. And then in part 3, I'm going to talk about the different manifestations that we have of this governance structure in rural Angola, which is not through the government itself, but through its state-owned companies and through different actors, finally arriving at the question of privatization for the conclusion, which is a process that is currently underway in Angola. So without further ado, just to set up the question very quickly, talking about rural Angola and how it's set up with the rural economy, it's important to give you some statistics so that you understand more or less how the agricultural sector is set up. So according to the data, which is very weak data, which we have to admit, that the peasant laborers in Angola today, the peasantry, so the common person working in agriculture in Angola, they represent 80% of the country's current agricultural production and 92% of the land under cultivation, which leaves only a very tiny part for this modernization effort, which is underway and which has been underway, as I'll explain, particularly since 2002, after the end of the Civil War. So this idea that only 8% of the land is under cultivation by modern methods and only 3% of the total employment in Angola is done through agriculture formally. We're going to see that this represents a very small minority in the Angolan sector, and we're going to see how trying to prop up this sector to the detriment of all of the peasantry is going to element this idea of an illiberal state building in Angola. So I chose Dominique Darbon's projected states to partly explain the government's projection of power into its peripheries, which can be contradictory, as I mentioned, because I'm not going to talk about the projection of the administrative and the bureaucracy in Angola. And this is because in Angola, it's obviously had its own history, and it's very complicated to try to understand this deployment of the administrative state in Angola. It's estimated that in 2002, only 40% of the territory was controlled by the MPLA, which is the ruling party, which was victorious in 2002. So only 40% of the territory was administered by the recognized government upon the end of the Civil War. And if we look at the different levels of the administrative state also, most of this concentration outside of these territories, they were concentrated in the provincial capitals. So in the provincial capitals, yes, there was and there is administrative state that functions, that represents the government in the provincial capitals. But then if we go to the lower levels of the municipalities or the communes, it was guessed that the administrative state wasn't active at all anywhere at the local level. So here we're talking about the administrative state at the local level in rural areas, and how if the administration of the government wasn't available or wasn't present, then who was there administrating the state? So this is the big question that we're trying to ask. And so I talk about the imagery of the projected states as a useful metaphorical imagination of how the state is structured, but also in how it sees itself and how it wants to be seen. So as a video projector, we can think about the projection of the state as an image, which is imaginary but real. It is a controlled image. It's chosen and crafted for its desired audience. And it's also designed behind closed doors and then unveiled to the audience in a specific way. And so through this idea of the projected states, this is of interest of us here, basing this projection on the definition that Mr. Darbon gives, which is the ideological, methodological, and instrumental transfer of the state into new spaces founded on the overall methodological and instrumental transfer, founded on the extraneité, so foreignness, so Western or Portuguese in this case, Westernness of the process, with a justification that such state construction would produce social conditions that would perpetuate this process according to a classical developmentalist logic. So with this definition, we can try to understand that the MPLA as the government, as the victorious government after 2002, they took this idea and they used their political past as a part of the colonial past from the Portuguese imperialism, which they took into a cultural and political convergence, working and building upon this process, taking this as their inspiration for the state that they were going to put into, try to establish in the future. And so the transfer of this projected state is therefore based on the Portuguese colonial experience, so the extraneité of the foreignness of this state projection, trying to build a socioeconomic development founded on an authoritarian socialism, which was also part of the state after independence and its connection with the Soviet bloc afterwards. So the first projection of the state was upon independence in 1975. The government nationalized all of the natural resources in the country. And so we have automatically the projection of the state de jure, if not de facto, over the entire territory. And so now they're going to be able to project with their own modern authority this new state that they would like to construct themselves. Alongside the projection of the state through the nationalization of natural resources, one of the first strategies that the government put into place was the nationalization of the enterprises that existed through the Portuguese and the creation of other national state-owned enterprises that would be created itself, and specifically on the agricultural sector. So during the colonial period, obviously the Portuguese created an extroverted economy where they were sending natural resources to Europe, to the United States, and so this economy based on natural resources was reproduced through these state-owned enterprises by the MPLA when they took power. And so one of the first ways that they projected their power was through these companies that was going to then take over this role of administrating, creating an administrative presence in these rural areas where the state otherwise wasn't present itself. And so we can see that from the very beginning, the government tried to create a network of state-owned enterprises that were going to completely control the agricultural sector, especially during the socialist period, where it was heavily regulated, heavily centralized, completely inefficient, that fell apart very quickly. But we can see, nevertheless, that these state-owned enterprises projected the state's ideology, the state's values, and the instruments to modernize the country, especially in the peripheries. But these state-owned enterprises also provided a governance structure that organized social and economic activities in the peripheries, eventually leading to fiscal contributions to the states that are theoretically at least later reinvested by the government itself. And if we do take Darwin's idea of the administrative state, we can say that these state-owned enterprises were administered. They were administered through government regulation published by the Diário de República. And so we can see the projection of these state-owned enterprises as a projection of the state itself. We're going to see some of these specific state-owned enterprises in part 3 of the discussion. For the, I'm going to go a little bit further. So the limits of Darwin's analysis of administrative reform and the projection of state power for this specific case study cannot only be found in the fact that the administrative state, we're not sure how much it has been exactly extended and projected into the peripheries. Even today, the studies are still lacking on this subject, but also in the historical timing with the Angola's emergence from war. Because specifically speaking about Mr. Darwin's thesis of this reform of the administrative state, it mostly came through these structural reform periods and the good governance of the World Bank and the Washington Consensus, that because of the civil war in Angola, they didn't experience the imposition of these other regulations that other states did have to go through. So in the 1980s, while other African countries were undergoing this structural reform period, trying to work on their debt problems and other inefficiencies, Angola did go through a liberalization of the economy, notably in 1987, where they officially liberalized the economy, but according to economists and researchers, the amount of actual liberalization of this economy is questionable, and we can see that state-owned enterprises still played a heavy role in the economy. Also in the 1990s, we have the collapse of the Soviet support to the socialist system. And so in 2002, when Angola comes out of the civil war, there's one real main idea of modernization and economic increase, which is the liberal economic model. And so when Angola finally has the opportunity to start to finally get back on its feet and start investing in this reconstruction, they're obviously heavily influenced by the fall of the Soviet option. And so they were living in a paradigm where it was the liberal model that was reigning. We also have the question of the democratization of the third wave of Samuel Huntington, which came in the 1990s. So in Angola, we have in 1992, we do have multi-party elections. So we have this new political game that the rulers have to play, which is multi-electoral politics. But if we follow again in 2002, when the war actually ended, it was also the moment when transitology towards democracy or towards a hybrid system was officially declared ended. And so we also have, alongside the end of this sort of democratization push, alongside September 11th in 2001 in the United States, where we quickly go from human security to safeguarding the stability of countries. And so democracy became less important. And so again, we have this authoritarianism of Angola, where the Western states, I would argue, considered to, they push less on the Angolan authorities as long as they were able to provide oil to the national economy or to the world economy and create stability in the country. The question of democracy wasn't, they didn't have as much pressure as other countries might have had. And finally, in 2002, we also have the emergence of this Eastern Alliance, specifically China, that arrives. And so we can see that in this historical influence, whereas Darbon talks about the administrative reforms that are imposed by the West due to these different historical processes, in Angola, because of the war, they were mostly spared. I think spared is probably the wrong word, but they were not as impacted by all of these different historical processes that were happening at the same time. So it's important to take that into account as we're looking at the authoritarianism of Angola as it moved to a new period in its nation's history, as it sought to rebuild and reconstruction, which was a sort of messianic goal of President José Eduardo dos Santos, as he sought to move from the victor of the civil war to the peacetime president who was going to rebuild the nation in all its splendor. And so if we move then to the question of illiberalism and illiberal peace building, if we look again very quickly at the history of how we've been looking at African states and how they come together, in the 1960s, we had a very liberal paradigm where we thought, well, the African states, they needed to develop economically, they needed to enter into industrialization, and then they were going to move towards a democracy and this sort of, again, Rostoian idea of a liberal paradigm of state building. As we saw that didn't happen through the different waves of democratization, quote unquote, and this idea of transitology, the second paradigm started looking at this transitology and looking at all of these different hybrid regimes and how they came to be and how they functioned. Then, trying to look at how they functioned, we have a third sort of paradigm where we start focusing more on the neo-patrimonial focus of how these states work from the interior, how the leaders hold power, how they make their connections to maintain their power. But what is argued in the paper of Africa's Illiberal State Builders by Ricardo Soares de Oliveira and by myself also, is that this idea, these different paradigms, they don't take into account the political imagination and the longue durée, the long-term vision of African political parties in trying to renew themselves in different spaces. Instead of just trying to maintain their power and not rock the boat, here we have with this illiberal state building idea that they are trying to build their state, project their power, but also renew their power in different places, which is the essentialness of this idea of illiberal state building in the peripheries. And so this illiberalness, as defined by Ricardo Soares Oliveira, he defines as a process of post-war reconstruction managed by local elites in defiance of liberal peace precepts, regarding civil liberties, the rule of law, the expansion of economic freedoms, and poverty alleviation, with a view to constructing a hegemonic order and elite stranglehold over the political economy. Is this last idea, the political economy, that for me is the most essential. And that's why we're going to be talking about the projection into the rural political economy for the second part. So how is this done? So this is done by the rural territorial domination of peripheral areas is a state building strategy, which is done by reducing certain resource flows, or as René Lemarchand says, a politics of penury, in order to weaken specific rural economic actors, which here are identified and categorized as the peasantry, as we just saw, who make up the large mass of economic agents in the rural areas. And so we can follow these patterns of resource allocation and deprivation, which provide a central analytical indicator to observe the development model imposed on these rural spaces. So just to give one quick idea of how the government tried to put itself in the driver's seat without any foreign meddling of accountability or conditioned aid, which is what most countries had to go through. We can look at the, as I mentioned earlier, NEPAD, the New Partnership for African Development, which was established in 2001, and specifically its program, which was the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, which looked at a four-pillar strategy for trying to recreate the agricultural sectors in Africa in the 21st century as they tried to fight against a huge drop in official development assistance, and as they tried to reinsert themselves into the international economy at a time when obviously the Southeast Asia model was working quite well. We have the BRICS, South Africa and Brazil specifically, as major competitors to their own agricultural models. And so in 2001, the NEPAD is created, and the Angolan authorities, they go to the meeting, they accept to engage with the meeting. They invite people from the FAO, the European Union, USAID, different donor and cooperation agencies, coordinated with the Ministry of Agriculture in Angola. They bring them in, they do a study on everything that needs to happen in order to rebuild the agricultural sector in Angola. And they produce a six-volume report in 2005, noting all of the different things that they need to do in order to rebuild the agricultural sector. So basically laying out a roadmap for the investments that need to be done. These investments, because it was part of the NEPAD, were designed to be shared, or the burden of the financial assistance was designed to be shared by different institutions in order to create a accountability mechanism, but also in case the governments themselves didn't have enough money on hand to do the investments themselves. So for example, for most of these proposed investments, 25% would be handled by the international financial institutions, 25% was going to be tried to found through the private sector, and then 50% would be the government providing the rest. So we see that the government, they accepted the NEPAD officials to come. They admitted that they needed help and that they needed to obviously reconstruct the sector, but they ultimately denied assistance and they pulled out of the program. So they pulled out of the program in 2005. And at the same time that this was happening is when Angola entered into negotiations with the international donor community trying to rebuild, and specifically about with their key ally, who is going to become a key ally in the future, which was China. And China essentially proposed oil for dollars credit financing. And so through China, they were able to get the financing in order to do many of the projects that were recommended by NEPAD, but obviously without the intervention of any World Bank or US aid or any international oversight into these investments. So I think that this shows the will. This is a very good case study to show the will of the Angolan authorities to go it alone, to try to, they understood that they needed to redevelop and reconstruct their agricultural sector, but they wanted to do it on their own terms, and they wanted to avoid any sort of meddling from any outside observers, which China wasn't going to do, obviously, because they were more content with just having contracts, construction contracts, and doing and getting oil for the loans. This brings me to my third part, to go very quick for the engineering resource flows, because here we see the recreation of state-owned enterprises in Angola, where going back to the NEPAD, one of the recommendations was recreating the irrigation structure of the agricultural sector. And so in 2005, the same year that they created the study, the government created a state-owned enterprise called SOPIR, which was specialized in irrigation of the agricultural sector, which costs more money than would have been proposed by the NEPAD program. And ultimately, it was found that all of the investments were insufficient, often misplaced in different areas where the irrigation wouldn't be as efficient as it could have been. Also, we see the reconstruction of a new state-owned enterprise, Mekeneng, which is based on the mechanization of the agricultural sector. So they import tractors, they import all of the machinery. And it was also financed a lot by the Chinese loans. And we also found that, again, all of these tractors were missing parts, they couldn't be repaired, they couldn't be maintained. And so it was also a failure, but was also something that was recommended by NEPAD. We also have the cooperative sector, which has been something that has existed since the 1975, where the Marxist-Leninist Agostinho Neto government started to create the cooperative movement in order to try to organize the economic and the social actors in the rural areas in order to better vigilate them. And we see that since 1975 until today, there has been an attempt at bringing this cooperative sector together. Today, it claims to have over 1 million members and numerous cooperatives, but it is also understood to be heavily underfinanced. It is the sector that essentially brings in the fertilizer and the machinery, et cetera, that is supposed to provide these inputs to the agricultural sector. Which also doesn't do it for lack of finance or mismanagement. So we can see that also the cooperative sector is, I look at it as an authoritarian means of bringing the economic sector, the rural economic sector together to control it in a question of domination rather than development. And so looking through these different ideas about seeing how the state-owned enterprises have seen a renewal since 2002, we see that they are involved in the irrigation sector, they are involved in the mechanization sector. They have even, the government even engaged with China to create 7 agro-industrial farms And so the government started to go into the production sector. And so the government is essentially present in all of the different value chains through the rural economy in order to control it, to capture it. And any of the investments, which there are investments, the World Bank has estimated there's been up to $2 billion invested since 2002. But we see that all of this investment goes towards this, again, this ideology of modernization of the peripheries, which again only contributes to 3% of the production of the employment and 8% of the land that is actually worked. So we can see this illiberal model, which is going to create a politics of penury for the masses, but is going to rather benefit those who are connected to this modernist authoritarian project, which are essentially going to be people that are linked to the government, which came in two waves in the 1990s, as Didier has pointed out also. In the 1990s, there was a large land grab by generals and soldiers in the rural areas. And since the 2002, there has been another wave of people setting up their farms and ranches in the peripheries. And these are, again, people who are sort of the new rural bourgeoisie or entrepreneurs, which are trying to set themselves up, obviously with the accordance of the government, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to do so. So to finish, we can look at a very interesting development as we're looking at illiberal state building and how the government has tried to project itself not through its administrative state, but rather through the state-owned enterprises, through the sort of proxies, we could say, in the peripheral areas. Is that with the election in 2017 of João Lourenço, we have an enormous change. Well, we're seeing an enormous change. We still haven't seen what sort of fruit it's going to bear. But many of these state-owned enterprises were found to be extremely lacking in efficiency. Some of the workers hadn't been paid for multiple years. They had to, the new government had to create programs in order to pay some of these cooperatives or some of these people that work for the state-owned enterprises, because they claimed that they hadn't been paid for years. So obviously you can imagine how well they're functioning if they're not paying any of their workers. And so João Lourenço decided to privatize a huge list, a huge part of the state-owned enterprises of the Angolan government. And so they produced a list of 195 companies to privatize, listed by sector. And in the agro-industrial sector, we can see finally that the government was involved literally from A to Z in the rural economy, especially in agriculture, because they had silos, they had farms, they had distribution points. All of these things are being privatized today. So it's an ongoing process. We still don't know what's going to happen with this process. It's very interesting because in Mozambique, if we try to make a comparison, in Mozambique, they went through their structural adjustments in the 1990s, and they privatized, they had a similar state-owned enterprise system, and they privatized up to 1,400 or 1,400 state-owned enterprises in Mozambique, which was claimed to go more towards the elites of the government, so less of clientelism and etc. And so we could be witnessing a renewal of that in Angola, but it's a process that's ongoing. And so this could bring us back to the point to conclude whether the government in its attempt to project itself into the peripheries with this modernization mentality, if they've been doing it through state-owned enterprises because they were afraid of unleashing liberal economics in the countryside, so they wanted to capture and control the agricultural sector itself, If we can consider that this was their attempt, that they didn't want to unleash private actors and let them accumulate their resources, then with this privatization campaign, we can ask ourselves whether this is a mission accomplished for the government, whether they think that they have finally set up themselves in a way that their political allies and their and the people connected to this modernist message, they are in the peripheral areas where they need to be in order to take the relay and move into this modernist sector and keep the MPLA present and renewing itself in the peripheral areas, or whether we're experiencing, as Beatrice Ibu said, this discharge of the Angolan states, because I've tried to establish very quickly that the state-owned enterprises are effectively governing areas in the rural Angola where the state otherwise isn't. And so through this discharge of the state-owned enterprises to the private actors, then we could see the Angolan authorities maybe declaring a mission failure of this development project, and so they're trying to move into another paradigm, again trying to find a way to renew themselves in the peripheral spaces. So I'll finish there for the moment, and I welcome your questions. And if some of it wasn't clear, then I'm happy to try to clarify. Thank you.